All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about my grandpa's teachings and kind of describe how it kind of confused me a little bit. So, like, I couldn't tell if he was really right wing or left wing at times, even though I thought that he was mainly right wing and metapsychiatry was right wing, and I'm going to get to that. But I'm talking about like 2019, 2018 time period. So I'll just kind of describe like some of the things that he taught me. So as I said, he started teaching me again. I started playing with Compton College. And he was happy that I was playing with Compton College. Well, I was playing first with ULA in Compton, University of Los Angeles, but then I moved to play with Compton College. And he was happy because, then I was a part of the anti-entropic ordering function. And so he started teaching me again. But so my grandpa's big thing about, my grandpa was happy that I was playing basketball because he says, okay, now you're part of synergy. You're part of something creative. You're part of the anti-entropic ordering function. He didn't realize I also discovered the theory of everything, and that's what I was working on. He didn't believe the quadrant model. He didn't think it was a theory of everything. I remember my grandpa, he would ask me, he was like, so what is the quadrant model? So you're saying some things are organized in force. So what? And I'm like, Grandpa, it's not just some things. Our existence is mainly, if you look at every single area, you're going to see the quadrant pattern because it's supernatural. There is this fourfold pattern that pervades everything. It's a holofractal pattern that you see everywhere. But my grandpa didn't understand. My grandpa's like, okay, there's some things that are organized in force. So what? So he's like, how is that a theory of everything? I'm like, it is. He's like, well, it's like, it's not really a theory. It's more of just a model that some things are organized in force. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm saying, Grandpa. You see, and that's the most important thing is if my grandpa didn't understand reality, my grandpa didn't understand. So my grandpa's, his whole thing is like, okay, everything is energy. And he thought that there was like a impetus within the energy to create more complex patterns and stuff. But he didn't believe, he thought that, that it did evolve, that the universe, he said that his framework of understanding, like my grandpa said, he said that he doesn't believe anything. Belief is just shaped by the ego. But he said his framework of understanding is that reality is like billions of years old, and and the energy patterns they organized, and there's a complexification principle within existence, and it moved toward humans, and eventually there's going to be something that moves beyond humans, what comes after life, my grandpa calls it. So, and it's like Sri Aurobindo talks about, and that's like the kingdom of heaven. But my grandpa thought that things were kind of random. He thought that he didn't think that there was he thought that when I told my grandpa, no, there's a quadrant pattern that pervades things, and yes, there is power in this quadrant that, like I told him that there's this guy who would make a quadrant in a circle. He's a famous Jewish guy, I think. He'd make a quadrant in a circle, and he would be able to create rain. And my grandpa's like, that seems like magical thinking. That seems like magical thinking. But I'm like, dude, you don't understand reality. We're in a quadrant matrix existence where stuff like that, there is some sort of magical stuff like that because it's like a dream reality organized and oriented around the quadrant pattern. But he didn't understand that. He thought that was magical thinking. So again, my grandpa was very spiritual, but at the same time, he tried to make his spirituality rational. So my grandpa, like I said, I would say that it's possible that if Jesus existed, he could manipulate energy, like he could turn water to wine, perhaps, right? Because we're in a dream reality. But my grandpa would be like, he tried to make it very scientific and naturalistic. He'd be like, yes, because Jesus understood that everything is energy, so he could manipulate things. But my grandpa didn't believe in God. He just thought that God was energy, and you can manipulate energy, and if you're in the flow, you can manipulate the energy, and that's why Jesus could literally move a mountain. My grandpa didn't think that was a metaphor. But like I said, when I was a communist Marxist, I wanted to think that all that was metaphors because I wanted to destroy Christianity and destroy religion, and I wanted to believe, yeah, move the mountains. I studied with this Korean cult, and they said, no, moving mountains just represents making leaders change. And I was like, yeah, that's a communist, to make the leaders more communist. And, I wanted to believe that everything was just metaphors in the Bible. But my grandpa didn't see it as metaphors. My grandpa saw it as literal, like, yeah, you can move the mountains if you understand that everything is energy, and then you can manipulate the energy, and you could literally move a mountain. But, so he was very spiritual, but also trying to be scientific at the same time. He's like, no, this isn't magical. He'd say, that's not magic, it's science. If you understand that everything is energy, then yes, you can turn water to wine, because my grandpa would be like, yes, it's just different combinations of quarks and leptons and stuff. And if you understand that everything's just energy, you could literally turn water to wine. So, but I wanted to believe, no, you can't literally turn water to wine. That was just a metaphor of Jesus turning the water to wine as the God of Israel turns the Nile River to blood because that was a representation of the destruction of the Roman Empire, because I was anti-white communist and I wanted to just believe that it was just all metaphors and destruction of the Roman Empire because the Romans represent white people and like that. But my grandpa, he wanted to be like, no, right. Like he wanted to see, no, Jesus literally could turn water to wine. I wanted to believe that Jesus didn't even exist. I wanted to believe the whole Bible was just metaphors and just because I wanted to destroy Christianity because I saw it as white supremacist. But my grandpa wanted to be like, no, Ryan, Jesus could turn water to wine because he understood that everything is energy, everything is one, right? Okay, so this is kind of my grandpa's teachings, right? But again, I was anti-religious Marxist. But at the same time, though, this is an interesting thing. Like, if you think about it, I believe the quadrant model. And the quadrant model is very magical. And if you think about it, it is kind of spiritual. And I remember I also believed in, like, synchronicities. I've always had a ton of synchronicities my whole life. Like I saw reality as kind of like a dream matrix, right? But my grandpa was like, that's magical. He thought that was magical thinking. He didn't believe in synchronicities. And he thought that it was based off of a fragile ego where people will try to see synchronicities in order to, make themselves feel superior and give themselves some structure in their life and stuff. If you have a fragile ego, you will try to, So my grandpa, it's interesting because he's very spiritual, but also he tried to make things rational. But I'm like, I believed in synchronicities because I've experienced them and I've seen it. And my understanding of reality is we're in a dream matrix, a quadrant dream matrix, and I don't see any contradiction between synchronicities, Jungian synchronicities, and the dream matrix. So basically, my grandpa and my understandings of reality collided, and I think that I'm more correct than my grandpa. But also, I'm very happy that my grandpa took me out of the Marxist way of viewing things. So I'll get to that. But my point is, my grandpa, like, I'll give some examples of what my grandpa taught that kind of confused me. So, like, my grandpa would teach that abortion, so I asked him, what do you think of abortion? And my grandpa said, well, it's a concession. If people aren't in the flow, abortion is a concession, because my grandpa said, if you don't have abortion, then there's going to be women who have abortions and kill themselves. And that you saw that when they outlawed abortions. And so I'm like, okay. But my grandpa also told me, though, but if you're in the flow, you probably wouldn't have an abortion, because if you recognize that everything is one, you recognize that everything is an energy, you have respect for the energy patterns. And a fetus, my grandpa said, killing a fetus, if you're in the flow, my grandpa said, you wouldn't even want to kill an insect because everything is one. So why would you kill a fetus? And my grandpa also described that, and my grandpa said, if you have an abortion, it could lead to problems in the afterlife. But my grandpa would say it's not the afterlife, because that's magical thinking. But my grandpa says, when you die, it's more difficult to leave the illusion of the separate body. And that's what people call hell. So my grandpa would be like, yeah. So I would be like, so grandpa, are you a leftist? Because I'm thinking, is he a leftist? Because he's kind of for abortion, it seems like. But at the same time, if you really dig into what he's teaching, he's not. Because he also said, like, if you have a baby too, having a baby can put you in a context larger than yourself. Whereas before you have a baby, you're more focused on the self. But when you have a baby, now you're focusing on something larger than yourself that can help take you out of yourself, that can help facilitate the flow. So, and he said, so if you stay selfish and you decide to abort a baby, then that could keep you maintained within the self. Whereas a baby can help put you in a larger context that can help to facilitate the flow, which is the transcendence of the self. So I'm thinking, though, but at the same time, my grandpa would be like, but, in the flow, there is no formula. So if you're in the flow, you can discern all of the parameters, all of everything that's going on. And you can say, okay, look, we're in a society where there's a lot of premarital sex. If we ban abortions, there's going to be a lot of women killing themselves, having illegal abortions. So we make a concession and we allow for abortions. So I'm like, okay, so grandpa, are you leftist or right wing? Because when I was a leftist, I always wanted to be for abortions. I always wanted to think the people who are against abortions are just the white supremacist Nazis. And I didn't like white people. I wanted to destroy white people because I was like, they just want to maintain the white race. And I was for abortion. And I was always for abortion. I was like a leftist and anti-white. But I was for promiscuity of women. But my grandpa also said that about abortions. He said, it also can encourage promiscuity, my grandpa says, he would later teach me, promiscuity is not existentially valid because it doesn't lead to happiness. It's self-confirmatory. So again, that's why I always think, oh, my grandpa's a right-winger. He's clearly a right-winger. He's clearly a right-winger Nazi. But then I'm like, at the same time, though, he has some subtleties to what he teaches. So Another example was like drugs. Like I remember I at one point I was, kind of bragging about how I never drank alcohol and I never smoked any weed. And that's true. I still to this day have never drank alcohol or smoked weed or done any drugs. I've only smoked cigars. That's all I've done. And just recently. But I kind of had like an air of superiority about that. And I was bragging about it online. And my grandpa said, well, that air of superiority, that arrogance that I kind of had about it, that's kind of self-confirmatory. And my grandpa also told me, like he said, there's no formula for the flow. And my grandpa said, if you're in the flow, maybe taking a drug could help to break someone out of something that he's stuck in. You never know. There is no formula for the flow. Now, my grandpa would say, for the most part, he said, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So what he's saying is that that taking drugs, for the most part, people aren't prepared for it, and it makes them more crazy, and they end up worse off than they were before the drugs, and it can have negative effects, very negative effects. But my grandpa would also say there's no formula for the flow. It's also possible that somebody could be stuck in a dualistic mode of consciousness, and maybe he does take a drug that breaks him out of it, and perform, and it helps. My grandpa would probably say like helps to break the clog of energy within his energy system, and creates and helps to facilitate the flow. So my grandpa said there is no formula. So to judge people who do drugs might not necessarily be the flow, because there's no formula. But my grandpa would also say at the same time, there's always concessions. So this is what my grandpa taught, and this is what he taught me. This was like at the time, 2018, 2019. I remember I was driving with him in the car, and I asked my grandpa, like, so grandpa, what do you think about the idea? What does Jesus mean when he says that he came to fulfill the law? And my grandpa said, because Jesus represents the flow, and when you're in the flow, you don't need a law. But the law is a concession to for most people who are not in the flow. So my grandpa would even say, like, the law can also, like, rituals, they will help you get in the flow. Like, for instance, like I said, the ritual of not separating foods during the Sabbath. My grandpa says not separating the food represents unification consciousness. When you separate foods, that represents dualistic consciousness. And when you're in the Sabbath, you want to break free to the flow. He says the 7 days you work, but then the 6 days you work, the seventh day, you're in the flow. And that's like the flow. When you work and then you let go and then you get in the flow. So, and that's unification consciousness, and that's oneness consciousness. But again, like I was confused. I was like, well, okay, unification consciousness, so we should all race mix. Because I didn't understand what my grandpa was teaching. Because that was still my Jewish ego. Because I thought that, I wasn't able, because that was my default. That's what I wanted to believe. Because I wanted to defeat the white race, because I saw myself as Jewish, right? But my grandpa, he would tell me, but if you're in the flow, you don't need any law. But as a concession, the law helps to keep people from deviating to modes of being that can lead to negative consequences and get people stuck in deeper dualistic software and the illusion that they are a separate self. So these are things that my grandpa's teaching. So I'm like, okay, so is he leftist? Is he right-wing? It seems more right-wing, seems more like a right-wing white supremacist. But at the same time, he says there's concessions. Maybe he's for drugs like the leftists are. When I was a leftist and I was anti-white, I was for drugs. I thought that drugs should be legal because I was like, it's just the white supremacists. They just stop drugs because usually that's associated with black people who do drugs, and then they can put them in jail. And I wanted there to be no jail because I thought jail was just white supremacist, and the black people are just victims, and the only reason why they do drugs is because they're victims of the white man, and they're suffering, so they do drugs to help alleviate the suffering. And it's just the white man's fault with everything, and but then. So that's the way that I looked at things. But I had an agenda to destroy the white people. But my grandpa would say, though, no, there's concessions. Sometimes there needs to be laws because people have immaturity, and laws protect people from immaturity. And if people just do drugs, then they can get themselves caught in becoming, well, my grandpa would say, people could do drugs and they can become schizophrenic. As my grandpa said, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. And they become schizophrenic. And my grandpa would say that is very deep entrenchment in dualistic software, where, schizophrenics think that they are Messiah, and they think, my grandpa would say that there's a spiritual aspiration behind that. Yes, my grandpa would say everyone is the Messiah. Everyone is one with the energy. Or the people say, oh, I am God. My grandpa would say, yeah, everyone is a wave in the ocean. But my grandpa would say, though, their quote unquote awareness is not based around a higher transpersonal consciousness, but is more based on an impersonal lower level of consciousness that they are stuck in, where my grandpa would say they lack freedom of consciousness, where they become very paranoid and they're very stuck in fear. They're like, oh, people are out to get me. And again, my grandpa would say that fear is not the flow. The flow, my grandpa would say, is, when it says fear God, my grandpa says it's not fear, it's awe. Have awe of God, because awe is an openness and a joy. Like there's joy and openness, and that's more the free in the flow. But my grandpa would say that that fear is more a restricted form of consciousness, and that's where what schizophrenic is in, where he's very locked in and he's paranoid and he thinks that he's God. But my grandpa says that that's really a compensation for his lack of power. So then he inflates his ego in order to protect his illusion of the separate self that is become fragile. But you have to have, you do. It is important to have sympathy for such people, because it's true. A lot of those people were abused, and it's not just, quote unquote genetic. They were abused and they do lack power, and then they have a split and a fracture of consciousness, But again, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe, I don't necessarily know. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. If you're in the flow, my grandpa would say you continue to do your research. You don't pretend like you know stuff. So, but anyways, I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings. So I'm like, is he a left winger? Is he a right winger? He seems to be more right wing, but at the same time, it's complex. It's more sophisticated than that. So this is like 2019. So I'm becoming more of a right winger at this point in 2019. And I remember this was another thing that confused me. So I remember I wrote a book in 2019 called Transpersonal Metapsychiatry, where I was going through the teachings of Hinduism and other teachings, and I was putting them through my grandpa's framework, Hinduism and the Greek mythology and stuff. But at that point, remember, I was starting to become a little bit more of a right winger, white supremacist, and I remember I was kind of at that time for prison, and for the death penalty. But then my grandpa said that if you're in the flow, you're not necessarily for the death penalty. But I always thought that the death penalty, the people who were against the death penalty were more of the people who were anti-white, people who were against jail. Like I was against jail because I was anti-white. I wanted all the people of color to be free and basically mixing the white people and even the criminals. But my grandpa was like, if you're in the flow, you don't necessarily want any harm for anybody. So now it's more complex than that though. So like, for instance, my grandpa would say, I'll say, okay, well, what about if you're in a war? You're just going to let the people kill you? So that was another thing. My grandpa would say, no, you don't just let the people kill you. Yeah, you fight in the war. It's like the Bhagavad Gita. You do your duty, you fight, but you don't necessarily get caught in a restricted form of consciousness, predator-prey, where you desire to kill people. You kill the people, but it's not because of a predator-prey restricted form of consciousness. Sometimes war, my grandpa would say, is a concession. If you're in the flow, there wouldn't probably not be in war. You wouldn't be in the situation where you get in the war. But there's always concessions, and people are in dualistic software. And to say that, you're never allowed to kill, you're never allowed to fight, you're never allowed to go to war, my grandpa would say that that's a formula, and that's not necessarily the flow. So again, so my grandpa would say, so the death penalty, my grandpa would say, if you're in the flow, you don't necessarily want to kill anybody. You would want to help everybody. My grandpa would say, even Hitler, to break free of his dualistic software through, whatever you can do to help to engage that person to transcend his lower levels of consciousness. So I'm trying to understand my grandpa's teachings at this point. This is like 2019. Okay, so I'm going to get what happens next in the story.